Right, let's just jump straight into this explainer. If you've been feeling absolutely exhausted by the constant state of political division lately, well, you're definitely not alone. It's draining. But surprisingly, the thinkers of ancient Greece and Rome actually left us a highly practical, data-backed toolkit for surviving our modern political chaos.
So the big question on probably all of our minds, especially when we look at the sheer emotional toll of recent elections, is this. How do we actually survive today's toxic politics without losing our minds or our relationships? I mean, we're constantly bombarded by outrage, and it just feels like every single conversation is a minefield waiting to detonate. And the discourse really has shifted drastically, hasn't it? We've moved away from constructive dialogue, where we, genuinely try to understand each other, straight into toxic argumentation. The philosopher Massimo Pigliucci actually compares modern political debates to that classic Monty Python argument clinic sketch. We aren't having actual conversations anymore, we're just dichotomizing everything into yes or no, good or evil, and literally just yelling those absolute positions at each other across the void. To tackle this, today's explainer is broken down into 5 key areas: navigating toxic political discourse, the 3 Stoic Pillars, correcting modern misinterpretations, anger as brief insanity, and finally, civic duty and resilience. Starting with Section 1, Navigating Toxic Political Discourse. The problem with modern politics. The real issue here is that we're increasingly treating people who disagree with us not just as incorrect about a policy, but as downright evil. And that makes any functional democracy incredibly hard to sustain. Moving to Section 2, the 3 Stoic Pillars. Ancient frameworks for modern chaos. So how exactly did the ancients handle deeply divided societies during their own eras of political collapse? Well, philosopher Massimo Pigliucci breaks Stoicism down into these 3 super easy-to-remember pillars, and he emphasizes that human nature is fundamentally social and rational. To a Stoic, living according to nature doesn't mean, running off into the woods to live off the grid. It means using our unique human ability to reason so we can act in a pro-social way. We are biologically wired to cooperate with one another. And when we combine that pro-social nature with the dichotomy of control and then apply the 4 cardinal virtues, which are courage, justice, prudence, and temperance, we get this incredibly robust moral compass, a compass that can guide us through absolutely any political climate, no matter how volatile. The really crucial piece of the puzzle here is applying that dichotomy of control directly to elections. It's an absolute game changer. It requires us to completely separate our internal judgments and actions from the external outcomes we just cannot force. Think about it. Internally, you completely control your own judgments. You control who you vote for, where you donate your time or money, and exactly how you speak to someone during a debate. That is your sole domain of absolute power. Externally, though, you do not control how other people vote, and ultimately you don't control who wins the election. Focusing your energy exclusively on your internal actions maximizes your agency, and it prepares you to accept those external outcomes with complete equanimity. Which brings us to Section 3, Correcting Modern Misinterpretations, Reclaiming the Philosophy. Stoicism is actually having a massive resurgence right now, but because it's so popular, it's being pulled in some contradictory directions that honestly require a bit of objective clarification. Recently, as documented in an academic journal article by researcher Matthew Sharp, some alt-right groups have attempted to claim Stoicism as a nativist or even misogynistic ideology. You've probably seen blogs cherry-picking isolated quotes from Marcus Aurelius to support really rigid, patriarchal worldviews. But scholars are quick to point out that this alt-Stoicism completely ignores the explicit historical text. Roman Stoics like Musonius Rufus and Seneca clearly argued that women possess the exact same intellectual power and capacity for virtue as men. So those modern, exclusionary interpretations, they just don't hold up to the history. In fact, historical records revealed that Nazi classicists totally rejected Stoicism. They viewed its inclusive, egalitarian origins as a direct threat to their hierarchical worldview. And there's a good reason for that. As researchers point out, the founders of Stoicism in the Hellenistic era largely came from the Near East. Zeno, the main founder of the school, actually had Semitic roots. So the extreme far right of the 1930s accurately recognized that Stoicism's core belief, the fundamental, unalterable equality of all human beings, was just completely incompatible with their racially destructive agenda. And that incompatibility exists because the Stoics were early champions of cosmopolitanism. They believed we were all fundamentally connected by our shared ability to reason, making us all, literally, citizens of the world. The Stoic philosopher Hierocles talked about this in terms of widening the circles of our concern. It's like we start with ourselves at the center, right? Then we expand our care to our family,
further out to our local community, our country, and eventually we have to widen that circle to encompass the entire human race. You simply cannot be a nativist and a Stoic at the same time. It directly contradicts the philosophy's most basic premise of Universal Brotherhood.
Let's look at Section 4, Anger as Brief Insanity, the Anatomy of Emotion. So, how does that cosmopolitan view actually change how we handle our internal emotional regulation during really intense political disagreements?
Well, the ancient Roman philosopher Seneca literally wrote the book on anger. He vividly described it as a temporary madness that completely destroys our ability to reason. He called it the most hideous and frenzied of all emotions. And to be clear here, the Stoics didn't believe in just suppressing emotions. That's actually a super common misconception. But they absolutely believed in managing the unhealthy ones before they completely bypass our logic.
I just love this analogy from Seneca. He gives us a powerful warning about entering a political debate with fury. He says even if your anger is totally justified, even if you're witnessing a real, undeniable injustice, acting out of anger is still counterproductive. It overtakes your reasoning faculty. You lose your strategic mind. You basically become a falling rock, shattering yourself just to crush your opponent.
And fascinatingly, modern neuroscience actually backs this up. When you operate out of fear, hatred, or toxic anger, your amygdala, that primal fight-or-flight center, takes completely over. Those unhealthy emotions hijack the brain and entirely bypass your prefrontal lobes, which is where your complex, rational decision-making actually happens. But healthy emotions? Things like a profound desire for justice or a genuine love for your community, those align perfectly with reason. They keep the neocortex engaged, allowing your brain to work as a unified logical system so you can actually solve complex political problems instead of just screaming about them. Finally, Section 5, Civic Duty and Resilience, Practical Action and Data.
Because look, Stoicism is definitely not about passively sitting back and letting the world burn while you meditate. Instead of avoiding politics, Stoics engage deeply through specific, grounded duties. First, they investigate thoroughly rather than immediately reacting to some viral, emotionally charged headline. Second, they evaluate political leaders based on consistent character and virtue, rather than just empty campaign promises. And crucially, they accept democratic outcomes with humility. Remember, if your preferred candidate loses, that's where the dichotomy of control kicks in. Enduring that loss with grace is actually a fundamental part of your civic duty.
And this isn't just theory. History is full of Stoic activists who fought for justice while keeping their inner calm, proving this philosophy is built for the real world. You had Gaius Blosus fighting tirelessly for land reform for the poor in Rome. Cato the Younger famously and stubbornly opposing Julius Caesar's creeping tyranny in the Senate. And skipping ahead a bit, Nelson Mandela utilized the writings of Marcus Aurelius, which were actually secretly smuggled into his prison cell. He used those exact principles to completely change his approach. He shifted away from a consuming hatred of his captors toward a measured, highly effective, and ultimately victorious push for systemic justice.
Now, to prove just how uniquely effective this mindset is today, the Stoic Week 2024 report revealed a remarkable negative 0.65 correlation between Stoic practice and vulnerability to depression. For context, that is a massive statistical finding in the psychology world. Researchers tracked thousands of participants, and the data showed that the more someone applied these Stoic principles, like focusing on what they actually control and realizing that external political events don't dictate their inner worth, the significantly less vulnerable they became to clinical anxiety and depression.
This hard data perfectly illustrates that applying these 2,000-year-old techniques practically heals both our toxic political discourse and our personal mental health. By stripping away our reliance on the approval of others and just letting go of that furious anxiety over large-scale outcomes we physically cannot control, we build incredible internal resilience. We become much better citizens and honestly, infinitely happier, more stable people.
So, as you head out into the world today, I want to leave you with this final, lingering thought to ponder for your next debate. How will you apply the dichotomy of control to your next political conversation? Are you going to let the chaotic actions of others dictate your inner peace? Or will you focus entirely on your own pro-social, rational response? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep reasoning, keep reflecting, and I'll see you next time.